Hello. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about natural selection, which is really the meat of Darwin's theory and the meat of how we think of evolution today. Um, in the last video, we learned that we all have a common ancestor and that there's this idea of common descent. That explains the unity and how similar species are. But how did things end up so different? How did we get so many different species? How did we get so many different traits from that one common ancestor? Obviously, it took a very long time, and geological history was important for supporting Darwin's theory because it showed just how long the Earth had been around, and that allowed for the idea that maybe there's been enough time for all of these different species to evolve. So, before Darwin, there was Lamarck, and Lamarck believed that as species grew, as an individual grew, they could do things and acquire different traits. And so I think about this like if I go to the gym every day and I start doing some deadlift presses, then I'll get really strong and my muscles will get bigger and it'll be great. Um, and so what Lamarck thought was that then if I had kids, my kids would have bigger muscles. We can think of this also as in like giraffes really stretched for leaves. And so over the course of a giraffe's life, its neck got longer because it was reaching high up into the trees for leaves. Um, and then when it had kids, they inherited that little bit longer neck from that stretching. Darwin disagreed. Darwin thought, oh, I'll move myself so we can see him. Darwin thought that individuals don't actually evolve. He noticed that over the course of a lifetime, an individual doesn't change all that much outside of growth and development. He thought that populations as a whole evolve. And that is how we think of it today. Not individuals do not evolve. They can grow and change. You as a human might evolve in how you think and act. That colloquial use of the word evolve is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about entire populations, entire species that are changing over time. And so keep that in mind as we go ahead here. It's also important to note here the racist history of this picture that I've used as our opening slide. One of our big questions for this course is how has science promoted human thriving and also how has it reduced human thriving? And so this picture is a little sneak peek at how Darwin's theory has been used to reduce human thriving and how it's kind of been used to promote racism. And so this picture shows human evolution, human evolution from apes into humans. And this is a popular racist motif that compares Black and African people to apes. This is commonly known as the ape insult, and it applies Darwin's theory in a way that he never intended and is also inaccurate to back up racist ideas and policies. And it's been used like this throughout history. White people declared themselves superior because they were further from ape ancestors, meaning that they were more evolved. And this was absolutely false. It was based on some stories that white people told about African women mating with apes, which were also absolutely false and misrepresentations of what they found in their travels to Africa. We'll talk more about the weaponization of Darwin's theory when we discuss human evolution, but I just wanted to touch on this because this image here can be jarring and can be used in some very specific ways to promote racism, as I just explained. Okay, going back to comparative anatomy, in my last video, we talked about the human, the dog, the bird, and the whale, and how they have these similarities. And that kind of shows the unity of life and how things are similar and how they might have a common ancestor. Um, we call these structures that come from a common ancestor and have evolved over time, have changed over time as species have changed. We call these homologous structures. Homologous means that they have the same base, they have the same history, as in they came from an ancestor. And so comparative anatomy helps us to find these structures, and as I said last time, to compare them and see how they've changed over time to fulfill different functions, and also to promote exactly different functions that these different animals need to perform. If we look at these four animals, they seem very similar. They all have kind of the same shape to them. So they're long, they have fins, um, they have this smooth and kind of blubbery outer layer. Um, and they are all pretty aerodynamic in the way that they're shaped. And so it seems like these four species have a lot in common. And that might lead you to believe that maybe these species are really closely related. What we've actually found out is we've taken a look at DNA and compared the DNA of different species, is that these four are not all that related. Um, when they're not that related, but they have similar structures, we call those analogous structures. Unlike homologous structures, these did not come from a common ancestor. So a shark did not get its blubber from the same place that a dolphin did, or a whale, or a seal. And so if these animals don't have a recent ancestor in common, what do they have in common is the next question. Why would they be similar if they're not related? If we've talked about common descent, explaining the unity of life. The answer is found is there isn't the ocean. All of these animals live in the ocean or in water that's cold and wet. And so really they need that blubber. They need that slick body. They need the fins to move and exist in their environment. Um, and so environment is going to play a crucial role in Darwin's theory of evolution. The last kind of comparative anatomy that we'll talk about are called vestigial structures. Some of you probably at this point have had your wisdom teeth removed. It can be as painless as pulling a normal tooth, or it can be really painful and you're put under anesthesia because they were impacted and all these things. And you might get some pretty funny videos out of it. I've seen some good ones out there on the internet. But these wisdom teeth, we actively remove them because sometimes they're harmful to the growth of our mouths, and also they don't really do much. It's similar to how we have an appendix that is often removed when it bursts, and it seems like it also doesn't really do much. It's connected to our large intestine or our colon, but it doesn't seem to have a purpose. And really the only time that we notice our appendix is when it explodes and tries to kill us. This is also similar to how whales have pelvic bones. The pelvis is a structure that holds legs to the rest of your body and connects your spine to your legs and makes sure that you can walk. Not something that whales do a lot of. And even legs are something that whales don't even have. So why would whales have a pelvic bone, and why do we have appendices and wisdom teeth? These structures that no longer serve a purpose are called vestigial structures. And they are a big hint at natural selection, at evolution, that it's happening because something must have happened along these species' history to make them not useful anymore, if that makes sense. And so they used to have a purpose and they don't anymore. Otherwise, we think, why would these things exist if they never had a purpose? why would whales have pelvic bones if none of their ancestors ever had legs? And so we think that probably whales had ancestors with legs that then moved into the water, and those legs were lost in the evolutionary process. And so these are vestigial structures. We have homologous structures that come from a common ancestor. We have analogous structures that don't come from a common ancestor but serve the same purpose. And then we have vestigial structures, structures that seem to have hung around despite evolution that don't really do anything anymore. And so we know that organisms change. We know that maybe it has something to do with their environment because of analogous structures. Um, And so now the question is why and how would organisms change to fit their environment? The first thing we think about is that there must be a struggle for existence. It must be hard to exist, or else it wouldn't really matter what an organism looked like, what structures they had. So there must be some kind of struggle for existence. Like there must be limited resources. Like there must not be enough fish for all the bears out there, or else all of the bears would survive no matter what they looked like. There must be maybe there's predation, and so maybe there's a caterpillar out there eating all your eggs, and so the eggs, not everyone survives. Also, there must be variation. And so not only do some people not survive, but not people, but some organisms don't survive, but there also must be differences between organisms within the same species. Um, Different versions of traits. You like here within humans, there are some very tall people like Shaq and some very small people like the woman that he's with here. Some of these variations must have affected survival. And so, because not everyone survives, some of these variations are going to matter for survival. If you look at these birds, you can see the wildly differing shapes of their beaks. And this is actually some of what Darwin saw in the Galapagos on his expedition, was that finches had really different beaks. And it aligned with what kind of nuts they ate. And so this bird here must be eating something with a really hard shell. It's got a giant beak that looks real sharp, and like it'd be really good at cracking into like a big walnut or something like that. The little yellow bird down here, its beak doesn't look like it could crack through much, but maybe it's good at poking into small spaces like holes in trees to feed on small bugs or termites that might live in the wood. Um, these birds are somewhere in between. Maybe this one reaches in for bugs and it also breaks the occasional nut. Um, and this one, again, is closer, probably has to eat a little bit harder nuts. And so that variation, the birds with the stronger beaks could eat more nuts. And because there's limited resources, they got more of the nuts, they must have survived. And so that variation um, has an impact on the species because of that struggle for existence. The last idea that's important is that these traits must be passed on to offspring. If they weren't passed on to offspring, then it wouldn't matter who survived. If one bird survived over another, that wouldn't denote what the next generation would look like unless the traits that allowed them to survive were passed on to their offspring. And so there are a couple things, now that we've got the basis of the theory that natural selection happens because there is a struggle to survive, there's variation in a population, and traits are inheritable. Now that we know that natural selection happens because of those three things, there are some major pitfalls that we want to avoid when talking about natural selection. The first is talking about natural selection as an active process, that the organisms in some way are controlling how they evolve. They do not. The organisms have no say in what they come to be. Well, this little boy might dream about becoming big and strong one day. It's not going to happen through evolution, um, just because he wants it to. And so, like, the birds do not get stronger beaks just because they want to eat a different kind of food. They have no say. It is not like they are hoping and wishing and dreaming for some specific trait to evolve. It also doesn't create perfect organisms. It's working with the variation that exists in the population. And so it can't create a bigger beaked bird if a bird with bigger beaks does not already exist. And so Hannah Montana was absolutely right. Nobody's perfect. The other thing is that populations do not evolve because they need to. This is a great point to talk about survival of the fittest. And so populations do not evolve and change in order to survive. They do not become more fit so that they can survive. They survive, and because they are the ones that survive, they are more fit, and the next generation is more fit. When we talk about fitness here, we literally mean ability to survive and reproduce. It's all about reproducing. It's all about getting your genes into the next generation. And so it's not really survival of the fittest as it is survival of the good enough to reproduce. Like, if you can have offspring, then you are getting your traits into the next generation. And that means that you had fitness as we have defined it in Darwin's terms. One more thing is that the environment causes these changes in a population. That's not exactly how it works. The population doesn't work to fit the environment. It does not kind of actively say, like a shark does not say, hey, I live in the water, I should grow a bigger fin so that I can swim faster. What really happens is that the environment makes it impossible for the shark to survive unless it can swim in cold water. And because of this, sharks that do not have larger fins, that cannot swim fast enough, don't survive. The ones that do survive have large fins and can swim fast, and they pass those traits on to their offspring. And so the environment causes the changes. The population does not work to fit into its environment. It does not see a niche in the environment that it can fill. That happens, change happens because of the environment. The next big idea to avoid is individual evolution. That's going back to our buddy Lamarck. He was wrong. Individuals do not evolve. Because now we know about DNA and how traits are inherited, we're very sure that someone's genome, what makes up their DNA, does not change over their lifetime. And DNA is the only information that is passed on biologically from generation to generation. There are ideas and cultures and strategies that are passed on that young organisms learn very early on. But any innate trait, anything that is found biologically before an organism is kind of raised by its community, comes from DNA. And that does not change over the lifetime. So individuals do not evolve, populations do. That means that natural selection can only affect those inherited traits. So it can only affect things that are coded within DNA. Keep that in mind when you're thinking about how things evolve. It can only be an adaptation if it is coded for in DNA. We can think of evolution as a change in allele frequency. And so an allele is a different version of the same gene. If I think about how I have hazel eyes and my dad has brown eyes, those are different versions of the eye color gene. And so they're different alleles. That's the variation that we're talking about. And so evolution can be thought of as how that variation and the percent of people that have one version versus the other changes over time. And the way to say that is the change in allele frequency. Okay, almost done here. Key things to take away from this video. The main ideas that I want you to focus on going into your next activity. Natural selection is based on these three assumptions: the struggle for survival, aka not everyone survives in a population, not all offspring are viable. There's variation within the population, traits are different between organisms, and those traits can be inherited. Those are all key for natural selection. Natural selection is driven by the environment, and so environmental pressures are the driver for natural selection. Populations evolve, not individuals. Again, you are not evolving over time. Your DNA does not change throughout your life. And some of the evidence that allowed us to come up with this theory were these homologous, analogous, and vestigial structures that we've found. We also had some evidence in the fossil record that we talked about in the last video. And so these are the main things that you should be thinking about moving on to your next activity. So thanks for listening and good luck on the next step.